Welcome to Fear and Greed, the week ahead. I'm Sean Aylmer, and as always, I'm joined by economist Stephen Koukoulas. You'll find him at thekook.com and on Twitter using the handle thekook. Stephen, good morning.
Good morning, Sean.
We've got a pretty exciting week coming up. I mean, we know next week we've got the Reserve Bank making a decision on interest rates, but a fair bit of information this week will help them make that decision. Monthly inflation is a good starting point.
It's a very good starting point. And I think where we had the shock decision, and this is from the minutes of the RBA meeting that were released last week, and that shock decision to hike in June was pretty much predicated on two things. One was the surprisingly high monthly CPI previously and house prices going up. So the inflation numbers which come out this week will be really important for the RBA. If it remains elevated or we don't get that deceleration which the consensus is looking for, then it feeds into the RBA probably just chugging along and delivering another rate hike next week. So it's all eyes on the monthly CPI.
Okay, it's interesting how in the last 2 or 3 weeks there really has been a shift towards more rate hikes on the back of inflation, it seems. I mean, certainly a slowing in economic growth, but people are talking about 2 more rate hikes, potentially 3 more rate hikes. Where do you stand on that?
Look, it's incredible, and it's being reflected in the bond market. You know, we've had basically close to 100 basis points lift in bond yields, and that's from, let's call it roughly 3% about a month ago to roughly 4% as we speak now. So that's a big move. And of course, as you're alluding to, that's on a reassessment of the inflation persistence, if we can call it that. And of course, what the Reserve Bank might be doing to sort of get that inflation rate back down. Gosh, I'm still looking at a range of indicators. Look, I've missed the last 2 or 3 RBA rate hikes. I'm looking at inflation decelerating, so I've got a big eye on the inflation numbers, but also the economy's weak. You know, we know that business confidence is down, retail spending's down. We've got a scenario where the lagging indicators, I don't want to be talking too much like an economist, but the things that always turn last in the business cycle are unemployment and inflation. They're the things that are still sticky, stubborn, whatever you want to call it, whereas the leading indicators, you know, building approvals, retail spending, consumer confidence, are the ones that are really under downward pressure.
So, I mean, we'll get retail sales this week as well for May. There's a lot of pressure on the Reserve Bank, though, to not go too hard on all this.
Yes, and I guess that's a delicate balancing act that it's trying to grapple with at the moment. That, you know, clearly we've had 400 points of rate hikes. Wow, you know, that's been a pretty chunky sort of tightening cycle from May last year. So in the space of about 14 months or so, we've had a really big lift in official interest rates. And the risk is that you do too much too late in the cycle, that, you know, it takes a while for the data to catch up with the interest rate action. So in a sense, we're looking at the inflation numbers, the retail numbers, the unemployment numbers, and they're really reflecting where policy was, 6 or 8 or 9 months ago. So that's the risk that the RBA is trying to grapple with. And that's why earlier in the year they were being a little bit more cautious. But of course, in the last couple of months, they've found a problem with inflation and they've kept on hiking.
Now, what I thought was interesting last week, Michelle Bullock, the Deputy Governor of the Reserve Bank and a candidate to take over from Phil Lowe if he doesn't get reappointed in September, she basically said we need to lose a bunch of jobs, about 140,000 jobs, to get the unemployment rate back up to about 4.5%, which will take pressure off wages, which will take pressure off inflation. Tying that into job vacancy figures, which are out this week, firstly, do you think it makes sense what she's talking about? Secondly, do you think we're going to get there based on the vacancy rate?
Look, I think what she said, and she copped a lot of flack for that comment, but it's largely true. Interest rates do not have a material long-run impact on the unemployment rate. You know, I posed the question on Twitter, for those who are criticising her, well, why don't we have interest rate and monetary policy settings to have, unemployment at 1%? 0%, because that's not what the interest rate settings are designed to achieve. So, look, we've got the labour market in the early stages of softening. We do know that the job vacancies numbers are trending down. So this week's number will be very important. Another, even a moderate fall in the job vacancy series would suggest that the labour market is coming off the boil. The unemployment rate's going to be trending up over the second half of 2023. So that will feed into, this assessment that Ms. Bullock made about the state of the labour market and the economy and whether we're going to get unemployment at 4.5%. I don't know, in 6 months, or we've got to wait 18 months before we get there.
So what's going to happen on interest rates next week? I know we're a week early, but I have to ask you.
Oh, look, well, it's all going to be predicated on the data this week, I hate to say, Sean. I don't really be sitting on the fence.
Good answer.
I wouldn't do it. I wouldn't hike from what I know now. As I said, the leading indicators on growth, global pressures on inflation are all pointing to lower inflation, weaker growth, and higher unemployment, as we're just sort of touching on. So I'd do nothing. I guess if we saw a shock persistence in inflation and the numbers, if we saw, for example, the retail spending numbers being resilient and even global events being resilient, then of course that feeds into a possibility, a probability of an interest rate hike. And I would just note in passing, when we're sort of focusing on the Bank of England rate hikes, the Fed being hawkish again last week, these sorts of indicators, China, certainly our largest export market, actually eased interest rates last week because its economy is a bit soggy and its annual inflation rate is 0%. So, it's not all inflation booming and rising. And for Australia, I pay a lot of attention to what's happening in China.
Yeah. Stephen, have a great week.
Thank you, Sean.
That was economist Stephen Koukoulas, better known as The Kook. You can find him at thekook.com and follow him on Twitter using the handle The Kook. I'm Sean Aylmer, and this is Fear and Greed, the week ahead.